Dave's dream cruised in calm air over a pristine deep blue sea, enclosed by a white sand atoll. Grey dots marked the positions of a flotilla of ships resting quietly at anchor. Her bombardier counted out the seconds, then pulled the trigger. The superfortress jumped upwards as its 10,300-pound payload fell away. Her pilot banked away, marking time in his head as he concentrated on the controls. All hell was unleashed below. Atoms smashed together and split, and for a microsecond a ball of pure energy snapped into being, racing outwards in a horrifying fireball. The toy ships disappeared from view, hidden by a rising mushroom cloud. Test Able, part of Operation Crossroads, was dramatic but actually rather disappointing. For reasons that have never been established, Dave's Dream dropped its Mark III atomic bomb 650 meters off target, and most of the major warships escaped significant damage. Even so, the fact of the matter was that the nature of the danger to ships from aircraft had changed. On one hand, high-level bombing was no longer just an irritation unlikely to cause damage to a battle fleet. It was now an existential risk. The Mark III used in Able was only about 25 kilotons of yield. Bombs were getting bigger, bombers were getting faster, and harder to intercept. The conventional threat had also changed. Years before, on the 8th of September 1943, the Italian battleship Roma was hit and sunk by two 3,500-pound Fritz X radio-guided glide bombs. Mass kamikaze suicide attacks on OSA rocket aircraft also provided an insight into the dangers of future precision standoff attacks from lower levels. Defending against faster attackers carrying more powerful weapons increased emphasis on interceptors able to meet bombers further out and be able to engage from the front quarter. Transonic aerodynamic issues meant that the performance differential between bombers and fighters would be narrow for at least a decade, so re-attacking from the beam or rear quarter would be challenging. Front quarter attacks ruled out cannons. Rockets were a feasible option provided the launching aircraft was equipped with the right radar and collision pursuit curve autopilot. But rockets were already known to be of only moderate accuracy, meaning that interceptors could only carry enough for one or two killing salvos. A guided missile carrying a substantial warhead would be a game changer for fleet defense. And in 1946, the Navy duly set out in pursuit of such a weapon. They instantly encountered a philosophical debate within their own organization. Was an air-to-air missile a guided projectile or a pilotless aircraft? The Bureau of Ordnance thought the former. The Bureau of Aeronautics thought the latter. Both wanted control of the development process. Ordnance paid for two weapon systems. The Meteor was designed under contract by MIT and Bell Labs to an unhelpfully indecisive specification that called for both surface and air-launched versions. Meteor was a monster of a missile weighing fully 580 pounds in a 9-inch diameter, 13.5-foot long airframe. It used semi-active radar homing guidance, similar to that which would ultimately end up on the Talos SAM, and it had a range of about 25 miles under ideal conditions. A handful of Meteors were launched by F-3D Skyknights in the early 1950s, before the program was cancelled in 1954. The radar, it turned out, was not a great deal of use against the backdrop of the sea, which is a prominent feature in naval combat. The other ordnance weapon was the Oriole, developed under contract by Glenn Martin Company. Oriole made the Meteor look a bit anemic. It was an active radar homing weapon on an 11-inch diameter, 11.5-foot long body. Weighing a flyweight 1,500 pounds, it had a range of only 10 miles and a peak speed of Mach 2.5. 56 of these were launched around Point Mugu until about 1953, when the program was also terminated. Active radar homing in a missile was beyond the technology level possible in the early 1950s, and the Oriole was just a touch too big, weighing as it did 10% of the combat weight of the then cutting-edge Grumman Cougar fighter. It's slightly ironic to me that the Bureau of Aeronautics, which was supposedly focused on unmanned aircraft, actually produced something that looked more like a projectile. The Bureau understood that the most difficult part of missile development was the guidance system. Instead of establishing a primary development contract with an aircraft company for the airframe and motor, it contracted with Sperry Gyroscope, a company that made navigation instruments for aircraft and ships. The project began in December 1946 and was codenamed Hotshot. As with the Sidewinder, which was developed in parallel but behind closed doors, the initial idea was to mate a seeker head and guidance fins to a 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket. When this proved impractical because of the amount of kit that was needed for guidance, the design team moved on to the famous 8-inch format. The missile body was developed by Douglas as Sperry lacked the experience. Sparrow I featured a less ambitious guidance system, but one that stood a chance of working. It was a beam rider. To employ it, the launching fighter acquired the target using its fire control radar, which illuminated the enemy with a narrow radar beam. Sparrow I had antennas in the tail that picked up the radar beam and attempted to steer the missile along its length to intercept the target. All up, the Sparrow I was 8 inches in diameter, just over 12 feet long, and weighed over 300 pounds. It's a neat-looking weapon with a distinctive dart-like appearance. 4 gas-driven pivoting triangular wings in the middle of the body, 4 fixed triangular tail fins, and an Aerojet solid-fuel rocket motor. On launch, the motor burned for 1.8 seconds, producing 7,800 pounds of force per second. For reference, the Thiokol Mark 17 of the AIM-9B Sidewinder delivered 8,800 pounds of thrust in a 2.2 second burn. Its terminal speed was only Mach 1.7 plus the velocity of the launching aircraft. Perhaps this is an aerodynamic issue, or perhaps facts have slipped down the years. One way or another, the Sparrow was always a weapon that appreciated being launched at high speed, preferably Mach 1.2 or so, but these earlier versions were limited to subsonic launch speeds only. Sparrow I carried a 20-kilogram warhead mounted behind the wings. It carried it to 6 miles at Mach 2.5. Both impact and radar proximity fuses were fitted. Initial tests had the radar operator manually guiding the beam to hold it on the target, but computerized systems were fitted to the service fighters that employed Sparrow I. Tests showed that against a non-maneuvering target, Sparrow I worked reasonably well, but far from perfectly. It actually took 4 years to get from the initial firings in 1948 to a system that could actually hit a target. That milestone was finally achieved in December 1952 when a Hellcat drone was hit and destroyed from 4,000 yards. The main issue with Sparrow I was that basic physics meant the radar beam widened further from the antenna. This resulted in the missile spiraling over wider and wider circles as it traveled towards the target. In turn, this reduced the missile's horizontal speed and meant that when it got to the target's position, it might be too far away for the fuse to detonate or for the warhead to be effective. Furthermore, beam riding presented a problem whenever the launching aircraft and the target were maneuvering relative to one another. The missile intercepted the changing beam as a curve rather than as a new direct route between itself and the target, thus spending its thrust following the curve. The issue was compounded by a basic design flaw that would dog the Sparrow throughout its life. Aerodynamically speaking, the missile homed and maneuvered best in flight when the fins were in the X position relative to the direction of flight, but it launched best when the fins were in a sort of plus position. So, as the Sparrow settled into its natural flight position, it would rotate 1/8 of a turn. Unfortunately, this seemingly minor adjustment disrupted the missile's gyros, making the spiraling problem worse. Later, this same issue would also impact the effectiveness of the semi-active homing versions. Sparrow I was initially tested on modified F3D-1M and F3D-2M Skynights, the latter fitted with an improved radar and an elongated nose. 4 rounds were carried on these aircraft, and in the 2M, the cannons were also deleted to make space for equipment. Such was the power of the guided missile that guns were obsolete in any case. The 4 1Ms were strictly for test purposes, but the 16 2Ms do appear to have made at least one deployment. The Skynight was not successful as a carrier fighter and rarely went aboard ship in any case. The -3M version of Vort's Cutlass was also armed with 4 Sparrows. The Cutlass was a day fighter and it didn't have a search radar. Therefore, to employ it, the Cutlass pilot pointed the nose of the aircraft in the target's direction as given by GCI. He would then activate the Aero 10 fire control system. This switched on the APQ-51 radar in the Cutlass's nose and instructed the Mark 16 Mod 4 armament control system to look for a target. Once the ACS locked on, a light would illuminate on the panel. Rather than having a screen showing the radar plot, the pilot instead had two gauges. One showed the bearing to the target and the other its range. If the pilot was satisfied that he had a lock on the right target, he was free to launch a missile. In a lot of ways, this detection and guidance system is quite like a radar lead computing gun sight. The pilot only uses it in the terminal phase of an attack, having flown the aircraft into position to visually acquire it via airborne early warning or GCI instructions. In this implementation, it was essentially a within visual range weapon. The only other fighter to deploy with the Sparrow I was the McDonnell F3H2M Demon, which could also carry 4 of the weapons on underwing pylons. The Demon had a search radar and was thus theoretically capable of firing its missiles from beyond visual range, within the constraints imposed by physics of a beam-riding system. 2,000 Sparrow Is were produced. They were initially designated AAMN-2 and later AIM-7A. Their service life was extremely short, with the weapons phased out in the late 1950s. That's despite a unit cost of around $15,000, which is roughly equivalent to $175,000 in 2024. In 1951, before Sparrow I was even operational, the Bureau of Aeronautics had begun to see the Sparrow as a modular system and explored alternative guidance systems. Sparrow II was developed by Douglas Aircraft, with the Bendix Corporation handling the guidance components. These systems were adapted from the cancelled Oriole. It was thus an ambitious idea that replaced the beam riding guidance with an active radar seeker. Remember that Sparrow is about a quarter of the size of Oriole, so a lot of miniaturization was needed. Incorporating the small radar in the guidance package meant lengthening the missile body by 4 inches and losing the pointed nose cone for a more capacious rounded unit. The radar was a K-band set, married up to an autopilot that guided the missile as soon as it left the rail. The motor was the same, meaning that Sparrow I had broadly similar performance characteristics to its predecessor. Sparrow II was simply far too ambitious for the technology available in the middle 50s. The frequencies of the K-band set meant that it was unable to penetrate clouds or rain. More problematic even than this was the way the attack profile was designed. Because it was fire and forget straight off the rail, it depended on the small radar being able to pick up its own target and keep it locked for the duration. Even something modern and advanced like the AMRAAM doesn't work this way. For a long shot, it will be initially guided by the launching aircraft, switching to active homing in the terminal phase of attack. It also benefits from 40 years of technology advancement. There are no valves in sight. Admittedly, the Sparrow II was restricted to ranges inside of 6 nautical miles, so maybe its always-on guidance worked a little better than it might on a traditional BVR shot. What was definitely an issue was the fact that to lock on or to scan for a target, the missile's delicate radar had to be switched on well in advance. It did not much like this, resulting in a higher than acceptable failure rate. Test firings were initially conducted from Skynights in 1952, which were then joined by Douglas Skyrays, equipped with the APQ-50 radar and associated fire control system. By 1955, the program was proceeding sufficiently well that the Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force both expressed an interest in the project. 5 Skyrays were outfitted with an integrated weapons system incorporating a larger dished APQ-64 radar, Aero 13 fire control system, and the Sparrow launch pylons. Although these aircraft were completed in 1956, the issues with the system were evident and it was gradually canned by 1957. The compromise between beam riding and active radar homing was semi-active radar homing, in which the missile homes on radar energy emitted by the firing aircraft's radar and then reflecting back towards it. In this case, Raytheon developed the seeker head and guidance computer again, beginning in 1951. Semi-active guidance was attractive because the signal on which the missile homed became stronger as the missile approached the target, but the missile itself did not require bulky radar emitters. Sparrow III started off broadly similar to 1 and 2, but would diverge considerably on its way to infamy in Vietnam. The rocket motor was initially the same, but the warhead grew to a 65-pound continuous rod type with far greater lethality. Maximum speed is typically given as Mach 4. This isn't right. The official specification from the time gives maximum velocity as 2,460 feet per second, or just under Mach 2.2. It could only be launched at subsonic speed, so the best speed it would attain was about Mach 3.1 or 2. Although the semi-active system was the best option available at the time, it was not without its issues. Complexity of the launching process was still very high. Multiple switch actuations and dial settings were required to get the radar into the right mode to acquire the target, then to lock on, to select the missile and to fire it. Once fired, the pilot had to keep the target in his front quarter, or the missile would lose the lock and veer off. As subsequent experience would prove, an awful lot had to go right simply to launch a missile in the appropriate envelope, let alone score a hit. Testing took place in relaxed conditions with little time pressure and against non-maneuvering targets. Probability of kill was 70% in this instance. The future had arrived. Initial deployment to the fleet's F-3H Demon squadrons began in 1958, and over 2,000 units were bought before production switched to improved versions. Under the new designation system, the initial Sparrow III was known as AIM-7C. I don't believe that any were ever fired in anger. AIM-7D was similar to C, but replaced the solid motor with a Thiokol Mark VI liquid-fueled rocket motor. This was a small, storable, packaged motor that featured in a Bureau request for proposal issued in August 1956 and was awarded to Reaction Motors in December of that year. It utilized inhibited and fuming nitric acid oxidizer and mixed amine fuel. Thrust data on the LR-44 is conspicuously absent. My best estimate, based on starting with the broadly similar motor in the AGM-12A and reducing power linearly with the size of the motor, is that it delivered 15,600 pounds of thrust in a 2-second burn, resulting in a top speed of Mach 2.5. It could, however, now be launched at supersonic speeds of up to Mach 1.3. The Seeker was also improved to give a detection range of 15 kilometers versus 12 on the Dash C. It featured improved anti-jamming features. Maneuvering capability remained roughly the same. The missile could pull up to 15 G to track the target. 7,500 rounds were made, and it was the primary armament on early F-4s. 5 combat kills were made in Vietnam with the AIM-7D, all on MiG-17s. AIM-7D paved the way for the most famous, or more accurately, the most infamous Sparrow variant. The AIM-7E Sparrow III-B entered production in 1963 and incorporated a new 7,600 pound thrust 2.9 second burn Mark 38 solid fuel motor, which weighed 154 pounds. That resulted in a higher maximum velocity at Mach 4 and a 75% range increase. Later E's were fitted with a similar but 3 pound heavier Mark 52 motor. Sparrow III's DPN-72 guidance and control system was composed of the radome, the target seeker, and flight control group, as well as the tunnel, cable, and waveguide. These components weighed 156 pounds all up. Total mass grew to 450 pounds, partly the result of a stronger structure that increased the maximum G load the missile could take from 15 G to 25. Range was between 1 and 18 miles. It could be launched up to Mach 2.2 and at any altitude. Fundamentally, though, it was intended to be a weapon for attacking high-altitude bombers flying straight and level. The arming and firing process also assumed that the crew had time to progress through the required engagement procedures. Engagements could start and ideally finish beyond visual range. Testing showed that in these conditions, probability of kill on trigger pull was still 71%. Strategists had been telling pilots that this was the way of things since the mid-1950s, so most US leaders and many pilots were unconcerned about the limitations of their missiles outside of these conditions. And in any case, even though 25,000 rounds would be produced, very few pilots had opportunity to shoot these expensive 500-pound weapons in training. They had to trust everything worked just swell. It didn't. On June 17, 1965, 2 F-4s from VF-21 on the Midway were flying cap for a strike on the Tran Hoa Bridge when they detected 2 contacts approaching, 37 miles away at 40,000 feet. The Phantoms accelerated to engage, closing the range rapidly. Earlier in the cruise, the squadron had discussed how best to use their missile-armed aircraft in just this situation. Their conclusion was that they should focus on using the Sparrow as the Sidewinder's limited envelope in the rear quarter was too restrictive. At this time, the rules of engagement required visual identification of any contact before firing was allowed. So while the pilots turned on the continuous wave illuminator that would guide the Sparrows and flipped the master arm switches to on, they could not yet fire, even though they were ready to do so at 10 miles. Closure speed was such that within 40 seconds they had visual contact with 4 MiG-17s heading straight for them. The lead Phantom pilot launched a single Sparrow from 3 miles, which blasted the MiG's right wing off. It somersaulted down. Following his leader, the second Phantom also fired a Sparrow. The Phantoms were carrying a slightly unusual loadout, with 2 Sparrows on the belly recesses, 1 on the right wing pylon and a pair of Sidewinders on the left wing pylon. The pylon-mounted Sparrow roared off. It too hit the target, obliterating the MiG. Sadly, this was not a sign of things to come. Operation Rolling Thunder ground on from the 2nd of March 1965 to the 2nd of November 1968. During that time, 330 AIM-7s were fired for around 27 kills. Of 303 unsuccessful launches, by far the largest issue was missile failure. 99 missiles guided on the target but missed, 214 didn't even get that far. To give you an idea of the problem, on the 14th of May 1967, 2 flights of 4 F-4s went up north escorting an F-105 strike package of 19 aircraft out of Korat. 16 MiG-17s attacked the formation and a massive dogfight ensued. Diving on an unsuspecting flight of MiGs, one of the F-4 flight leaders got a lock with a Sparrow from the target 6 o'clock. He squeezed the trigger. The Sparrow was ejected from his Phantom's belly. It failed to fire, and it dropped harmlessly to the earth. Spotting another group of enemies, he entered a hard, descending left turn and arrived undetected behind them. Once again, he got a lock and pulled the trigger. Once again, the 500-pound Sparrow fell from his aircraft and plunged 4,000 feet to the ground without firing. The other pair in this flight, Speedo 1 and 2, launched 2 Sparrows that did fire, but then failed to guide. Thus far, 4 missiles had been launched and none had functioned at all. While this was going on, the other flight, Elgin, shot 3 Sparrows and miraculously scored a hit. Homing in on another MiG, Elgin 1 set up his last shot. The Sparrow roared off his F-4 and then immediately veered hard to the right, disappearing out of sight. In this engagement, at least 8 Sparrows were launched for 1 hit. Of the remainder, all 7 failed to fire once free of the aircraft or did not guide. Believe it or not, this actually counts as above average performance for the Sparrow. During Rolling Thunder, its hit rate on trigger pull was just 8%. By the end of Rolling Thunder, the problems had reached crisis point. In a single period in May and June 1968, Navy F-4 crews shot 30 Sparrows in combat and all but 1 missed. 2 Phantoms were shot down in return. So $4.5 million of missiles had been fired and 2 $4 million aircraft had been destroyed just to destroy a single $1 million value MiG-21. Many of the problems with the missile were known about during this phase of the war, but little attention was given to addressing them by either the Air Force or the Navy until the post-November lull. Back in the mid-1950s, the F-4 had been designed around the Sparrow. The weapon was tightly integrated into it. Missiles were lighter than cannons that they replaced, and they were cheaper than aircraft, so when they were fired from range, they allowed the F-4, which was expensive, and its crew, which were expensive to train, to stay out of danger. Having the missile do the work meant that expensive and dangerous dogfight training could also be reduced, and by having so much technology in the missile, the F-4 could be made more flexible. US Air Force interceptors of the day, particularly the F-102 and F-106, were far more specialized because they did much of the work for their missiles and rockets in advance of firing. All this sounds very sensible, but it had led to a fiendishly complicated missile and an excessively complicated process to employ it. The most famous assessment of Sparrow was by the Navy captain Frank Ault. In reality, it's an evisceration. Ault was not a man to pull his punches. He had been captain of the Coral Sea in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1966 and 67, seeing the problems firsthand. When he was assigned the task of determining the issues with Navy air-to-air combat performance in the summer of 1968, he got right down to it. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to set aside training issues that meant that US pilots sometimes struggled to set up shots within the Sparrow's envelope. That aside, Alt's first revelation was a fact that had somehow been lost in the translation of the F4 and Sparrow weapon system combination into an operational system. The Sparrow had been intended as a one-use system. That is, a missile would be kept in perfect conditions in the carrier's magazine until it was required. When the time came, it would be hoisted up onto a Phantom and launched at a Soviet bomber. It had never been intended to return to base. But return to base it did. In the Navy, that meant being subjected to repeated catapult launches and arrested recoveries, not to mention the G-forces of a hard-turning fight. In the Air Force, the missiles were just as badly treated. The terrific humidity and monsoon rain of Vietnam were endured by missiles that more often than not were simply left attached to the fighters on their return to base. The standard operating procedure for Sparrow in the Navy had it being serviced after between 50 and 100 flights. The Air Force, being run by the technocrats at SAC, actually pulled the missiles off the aircraft every 10 missions. Unfortunately, the test and calibration units were not located close to the airfields. Sparrows were therefore sent back and forth in unsprung trucks on unpaved roads. Having been shaken to bits, they likely turned up back at their squadrons less calibrated than they started. Being as it was a highly sophisticated aircraft masquerading as a missile, the Sparrow was a sensitive beast. Even if problems were identified by the overstretched maintenance crews, they generally lacked the spare parts to fix them. Being resourceful, the technicians tried their best to fix the missiles in the field. One capacitor is just like the next one, no? Well, no indeed, and of course a hangar deck or tin hut is not the cleanroom conditions in which the Sparrow had been assembled. It was essentially a miracle when a pilot got to the point of engaging a MiG with a functioning Sparrow on his aircraft. Getting that missile to actually fire was a whole other game of chance. For starters, 25% of all the Sparrows fired simply dropped off the airframe and fell to the ground. The basic issue was that the Navy had taken a missile that had been designed to launch off a rail, as on the Demon, Skyknight and Cutlass, and had converted it to gravity drop. The Sparrow was attached to the Phantom via a telemetry umbilical. When the trigger was pulled, signals were exchanged between the fighter's fire control system and the Sparrow. Then the ejector feet would push the missile off the aircraft. As it dropped away, the umbilical spooled out 10 feet or so. Once that separation was reached, the cord jerked a pin out of the Sparrow, opening a circuit that engaged the missile's guidance system and fired the rocket motor. Needless to say, this was not really a reliable system in practice. Adding to the problems, the F4 itself also had issues. Squadrons using the type in Germany later realized that an average of 1.5 of the belly recesses on each aircraft had defective telemetry systems, meaning that they couldn't communicate with the Sparrows carried there at all. This fault couldn't be diagnosed from the cockpit. Technicians needed to go round each aircraft and check each of the 4 stations proactively, as if they didn't have enough to do. If we assume that we have a Phantom with a functioning missile and a functioning ejector system, we next hit the problem of crew workload. The Phantom had been designed for all-weather bomber interception a long way out from the carrier and under GCI conditions. Instrument flying was the order of the day in this scenario, and the missile switches and radar readouts were therefore mounted low down. In a dogfight with a MiG, the pilot and Rio, or guy in the back, would have to remember the right sequence while glancing into the cockpit as they tried to keep track of the enemy aircraft. Needless to say that many missiles were simply launched without the right sequence being followed. To make matters more difficult in a dogfight, the Phantom also had a range lockout that prevented a Sparrow being fired inside of 3,000 feet, which is problematic in a tight fight. Even if the pilot got the switches right, then the symbology displayed by the F4's fire control system was often misleading. The aircraft was supposed to show the pilot when he was within Sparrow engagement envelope. Unfortunately, the small print on that system said that these cues were only accurate when both the fighter and the target were flying straight and level. All of this is also assuming that the F4's radar was able to pick the target out from the background clutter. Oh, and that the radar was working at all. Reading reports of engagements in the Red Baron reports suggests that radar failures were quite common, rendering the Sparrow completely useless. If they got everything right, then they had to hold the MiG in the right place for 3.8 seconds for a full system lockup, and then another 1.4 seconds after they pulled the trigger. Alt's analysis suggested that on average a pilot had 2.2 seconds to make a shot in a dogfight, less than half of the 5.4 seconds the system required. Now, the F4 did have a second option for Sparrow engagement. This was called the bore sight lock-on and enabled the missiles to be fired in as little as 2.4 seconds total. Unfortunately, although this mode was in the manual and in the training syllabus, it had not actually ever been tested, and it didn't in fact work because the radar beam it used was far too narrow to allow the Phantom's primitive computer to hold the target. In the first 60 bore sight mode firings during Rolling Thunder, only one hit was scored. When the big white wingman finally got off the aircraft and headed to the target, the next thing the Phantom pilot now had to hope for was that the guidance gods were on his side. Sparrows to this point used a technique called conical scanning for guidance. In this system, the missile seeker head has two antennas in it. If these were held stationary, then they would both detect the radar beam reflecting back off the target in a single plane, but they would only detect that energy with the same strength if they were flying directly towards it. So if one signal is stronger than the other, then a simple logic can direct the missile to turn towards it, and vice versa. Rotating those two antennas at high speed allows them to provide target direction to the guidance computer in 2 dimensions. The missile thus flies a sort of circling track to the target, with a bit of damping to prevent control inputs expending too much energy or sending the missile out of control. Although brilliant in conception, conical scanning has some issues. First is that the system assumes that if one signal is stronger than the other, it's because the target is on that side of the missile's direction of travel. But this isn't actually necessarily true. Something as simple as rain or chaff, or as complicated as ECM, can block or weaken one signal. The problem gets worse closer to the target, as the differences in reflected strength from different parts of the airframe in a given rotation can confuse the guidance system. A maneuvering target makes this situation worse. Accuracy of a conically scanned antenna set is therefore limited to about 30 feet, which is why the Sparrow has such a big warhead. Later RAF testing suggested that the average missile only got within 60 or 90 feet, which would suggest that missiles would not be close enough to detonate the proximity fuse in more than 50% of firings, even if they guided. To make matters worse, when close to the ground or attempting to shoot at a target at very much lower altitude, reflections off the ground can overwhelm the signals reflecting back off the target. Even though the continuous wave guidance beam is relatively narrow, it naturally expands, so you're always going to get these reflections from beyond the target. You can always filter out weaker signals, but this prevents long shots, and therefore it's only used to a limited degree in the analog electronics within the Sparrow. And if the missile did guide properly, the Phantom pilot just had to hope that its thick white smoke trail wouldn't alert the MiG pilot. Fortunately, he was aided in this by the poor rearward visibility of the MiG-17, and poor visibility basically everywhere on the MiG-21. Fortunately, the 60-pound warhead was a guaranteed kill. No MiG survived a Sparrow hit during Rolling Thunder. Hopefully you can see that although the Sparrow and the associated Phantom weapons systems were technological marvels, but they contain many serious flaws that made taking a shot in anything other than the specific situation envisaged by the designers inherently low probability. And, as I'll get to later, Alt's team didn't actually pick up every issue. The TAC and the Navy both instituted changes in the relative lull between Rolling Thunder and Linebacker. The Navies were more far-reaching and focused as much on training as on technology. Even so, both services began to deploy the AIM-7E-2, referred to as the Dogfight Sparrow. This modified the AIM-7E with smaller wings to enable it to maneuver more effectively at close range. Its fuse was also improved. More importantly, a plug, known as the minimum range plug, could be installed in the missile on the ground to reduce the minimum launch range limiter from 3,000 feet to 1,500 feet. This was installed on almost all E-2s used in Vietnam. Both services also deployed new versions of the Phantom. The Navy's F-4J had an advanced new pulse Doppler radar that could pick out MiGs from the ground clutter and theoretically enable them to be shot at. Top Gun was also now a thing. The instructor's advice was simply not to use the Sparrow and instead learn how to maneuver into a good position for sidewinder shots. The Navy's AIM-9D and new AIM-9G were much improved and highly effective weapons when properly employed. TAC deployed the F-4E, featuring an internal Vulcan cannon as a backup weapon. This gets all the press, but it was actually a modification to the F4D that promised to be more important. During the later stages of Rolling Thunder, EC-121s had begun to use a system called Combat Tree, which enabled them to read the North Vietnamese fighters' IFF signals and thus detect them well outside the range they would be picked up on radar. A small number, less than a dozen, F4Ds were modified with Combat Tree in advance of Linebacker. They had dispensation to shoot targets from beyond visual range, in theory allowing them to use the Sparrow to its full potential. Over the 6 months of Linebacker, Sparrows downed another 29 MiGs. 282 missiles were fired to make these kills, resulting in a marginally improved 10% probability of kill. Across the entire war, then, 612 AIM-7s were fired for 56 kills, a 9% effectiveness rate. 404 missiles, or 2/3 of all firings, resulted in a missile failure. The dogfight Sparrow added another exciting problem to the mix. It had a tendency to spectacularly detonate 1,000 feet ahead of the launching aircraft for reasons that remain publicly unexplained. The other 25% just missed their targets entirely. There is a standout exception to all of this that I feel needs pointing out. Steve Ritchie, the only USAF ace of the war, scored all 5 of his kills with the Sparrow. In those 4 engagements, he launched 13 Sparrows for 5 kills. For the first kill, he fired a pair of missiles, both of which guided but only one exploded. In the second and the fifth, he ripple fired all 4 missiles, and in each case, only one missile hit the target. The third and fourth kills were also quite interesting. They happened during a 2-minute engagement on July the 8th. His first was a snapshot with 2 missiles in bore sight mode, with both Ritchie descending on the MiG from its 5 o'clock position and the MiG-21 turning very hard. Both Sparrows hit. He then attacked the leader in the MiG formation, again in bore sight mode, and this time within the minimum range. And again, this Sparrow hit and destroyed the MiG. Ritchie's kill rate in those engagements was 38%. His hit rate was actually either 46 or 54%, depending on whether we're counting the first shot on his first kill, which seems to have been a hit that didn't detonate. Is Ritchie just a statistical outlier, or was he just doing it right? Well, he certainly was an outlier as a pilot. His linebacker tour was his second. He had already completed one tour in 1968 as a fast FAC and had 195 combat missions under his belt. In 1969, he'd been selected to go to the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis and had subsequently been invited back as an instructor. At 26, he was the youngest instructor the program had ever had. His second tour, therefore, came after spending 2 years solely focused on air combat maneuvering. He knew the F4 and the Sparrow weapons system intimately. Because of his experience, he generally flew the Combat Tree F4D, which gave him certain advantages in how he was able to employ his missiles. This seems most relevant to his final victory, which was scored from beyond visual range. His double for 3 and 4 was, however, in a standard F4E, so tree is only a small factor. What seems clear is that Ritchie was an expert when it came to getting his aircraft in position to fire Sparrow. What is not immediately clear is why he experienced such a low malfunction rate in these engagements. Of his 13 shots, the statistics suggest that 4 should have failed to fire and 4 should have gone wild without guiding. That didn't happen. Maybe Ritchie's skills also extended to checking the maintenance records of his missiles, or perhaps he just earned that luck through his good flying and good control of his switches. In any case, Ritchie was the outlier. The Navy's Cunningham and Driscoll won their 5 with Sidewinder. The cooled Seeker versions of that missile were clearly superior to Sparrow in the dogfight arena. Irrespective, the Navy had already decided to supplement and partially replace the Sparrow with the AIM-54 Phoenix on the new F-14 Tomcat, but the USAF was committed to the weapon. The F-15 had the Sparrow as its primary weapon, just as the Phantom had before it. Fortunately, in 1963, development of a new Super Sparrow, designated AIM-7 F, had started. This missile's winding development journey only concluded after the end of Linebacker. Entering service in 1976, F had solid-state electronics for greatly improved reliability and more compact size of the guidance group. The new guidance system also worked with pulse Doppler radars and could therefore be used in a look-down, shoot-down attack profile. Aside from their greatly increased capability, reducing the space occupied by the electronics freed up space for a 20% larger 86-pound warhead. Better still, the F had a two-stage rocket motor to increase range and ability to maneuver. The boost stage of the motor delivered 5,750 pounds of thrust for 4.5 seconds, 24,875 pounds in total. The sustainer then kicked in for another 11 seconds, delivering 1,018 pounds per second. Maximum speed was the same at Mach 4, but maximum range when fired from 40,000 feet went up to a theoretical 53 miles versus 18 for the AIM-7E. Only the F-14 really had the radar to make use of that capability, and I've seen no evidence of shots at anything like that distance being taken. Realistic range was more like 15 miles. This new weapon became the standard in US squadrons, but it would not be US pilots that would take it into action in the coming decade and a half. The Middle East remained a cauldron for most of the 1970s and 80s, and the Sparrow was used extensively by two bitter enemies, Israel and Iran. Both of these countries' air arms operated F-4 Phantoms as the low in a low-high mix with Teen Series fighters. Iran operated the F-14A Tomcat, Israel the F-15A, and later also F-15C Eagle. Israel was the first of the two to use Sparrows in anger. It fired 49 of them during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, scoring 4 or 5 kills, but exact details remain quite sketchy. The first verifiable use of Sparrow I can find was on the morning of the 27th of June 1979, when 4 Eagles attacked 4 Syrian MiG-21s, which were attempting to intercept an Israeli strike going into Lebanon. The leading pair of F-15s engaged with AIM-7Fs from beyond visual range. Much to their surprise, but nobody else's, both missiles missed, and the Eagles then used sidewinders and cannon fire to down the MiGs. The first Sparrow's success came on the 24th of September 1979. MiG-21 was the victim. In total, IDF F-15s claimed to down 16 Syrian aircraft with Sparrows. Iran began the war with Iraq equipped with 140 Phantoms, a mix of D and E models, as well as some F-14s. The latter appear to have mainly carried AIM-54A Phoenix during the war, although they did actually claim 22 AIM-7 kills. The Iranian Air Force's first success with the Sparrow and Tomcat combination was on the 10th of September 1980, when a MiG-21 was shot down. This photo, which was taken on the 10th of November 1980, shows a MiG-23 caught by Tomcats as it attacked Iranian ground troops. It was dispatched with a single Sparrow shot at a height of just 1,000 feet. With the Tomcats providing cover, Phantoms were operating in a strike role, but usually carried 4 AIM-7E2 Sparrows under the fuselage. The first known Sparrow kill of the war by an F-4 was on the 1st of September 1981, where an F-4D destroyed an Iraqi MiG-23 MS. Sidewinder appears to have been the Iranians' favoured weapon on the F-4, and it was 18 months until they scored again with the Sparrow. This time it was an F-4E during the shooting, and a Su-22 was the victim. On the 2nd of April 1984, a SAM-class frigate detected a lone Iraqi aircraft patrolling the Gulf. 2 F-4s were scrambled to intercept. They encountered one of Iraq's brand new French Super Étendard strike aircraft and shot it down with 2 Sparrows from a range of about 6 miles. 3 days later, a Royal Saudi Air Force F-15D shot down an Iranian F-4E with an AIM-7F over the Gulf. And there were other, less successful Sparrow firings in that chaotic airspace. On the 8th of August 1987, 2 F-14As from VF-21 Freelancers intercepted a pair of Iranian Phantoms. They fired 2 Sparrows, but 1 missile malfunctioned and the Iranians avoided the other one. A relatively similar thing happened in the early moments of the brief 4th of January 1989 air battle near Tobruk. Having judged the Libyan MiG-23s to have hostile intent, the lead F-14 fired 2 AIM-7Fs, one at 14 miles and a second at 12, neither of which guided. Moments later, the other Tomcat crew also fired a Sparrow, this time from 5 miles, downing one of the MiGs. The second was dispatched with a Sidewinder. This was the final successful use of the weapon prior to Desert Storm. The final Iranian Sparrow kill was a Tu-22B blinder on the 19th of March 1988. Finally, the AIM-7 had claimed a jet bomber. after all those years. The Gulf War came at an inconvenient moment for the air dominance elements of the US Air Force. When Saddam invaded, they were less than a year away from having the AMRAAM available operationally. F-15 squadrons and their Navy comrades in F-14s and F-18s therefore deployed to the Gulf carrying AIM-7M Sparrows. AIM-7M was an early 1980s development of the F and featured a new inverse monopulse seeker that vastly improved performance in look-down modes and in ECM environments. Inverse monopulse guidance was only feasible with the new digital electronics emerging at the time. Rather than the rotating antennas of the conical scanning Sparrow, the Dash M featured a single dish with 4 receivers. These worked in concert with the fighter's radar, which now split the radar signal before it reached the radar dish. The two parts of the signal were encoded with different polarization before being recombined and sent out via the radar antenna. Although technically challenging to achieve, inverse monopulse has several significant advantages over conical scanning. Because the two parts of the signal carry different polarization, when they scatter back from the ground, the subsequent randomization of polarization that occurs allows these signals to be filtered out. Hence, the M Sparrow was finally capable of being fired in a look-down, shoot-down mode reliably. Similarly, ECM becomes much less effective because it is difficult to jam on the specific polarization used by the signal, and again, those jamming signals can be simply filtered out. Finally, the issues with close-in homing were removed because the 4-receiver antenna no longer needed to spin to provide guidance. Instead, the guidance system could triangulate target position based on the strength of the polarized signals at each of the 4 detectors. In testing, this version of the Sparrow hit the target on average, rather than being deposited into a 60-foot radius sphere around it, as in previous versions. The new guidance unit's upgraded computer also allowed it to fly more optimized flight paths for better overall performance at range, despite using the same motor arrangement as the F. M was a massive upgrade over the F model and significantly increased beyond visual range engagement potential. On the opening night of Desert Storm on the 17th of January 1991, an F-15 from the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron, better known as the Guerrillas, made the first kill of the war with this weapon, downing a MiG-29 from about 12 miles with a single Sparrow. An interesting and retro point for the historical record is that the Eagle's fire control computer did not recognize that a missile had been launched at all, leading to brief confusion in the US squadron as to whether the rocket motor they saw that night was one of theirs or whether it was coming the other way. Overall, 34 of 67 rounds hit their targets. That's just a touch over 50% probability of kill, albeit in better conditions than experienced over Vietnam. US AWACS coverage was excellent, their pilots were highly trained for air-to-air combat and were able to fire from beyond visual range. The failure rate was still worryingly high, though, particularly rounds that never fired and just dropped to the ground. In the aftermath of Desert Storm, a major problem with the Sparrow weapon system was finally detected and resolved. This was based on a problem with the ejector system, which used explosive cartridges to push the feet down and propel the missile away from the fighter far enough that its motor could fire without causing damage or interrupting the airflow. After the war, the Bitburg Eagle squadrons worked out that some batches of the cartridges were bad. In normal circumstances, this problem would be hard to detect because it manifested in a particular way. Eagles, and probably Phantoms in previous generations, often flew very high with the cartridges in place. As a result, the cartridges got cold soaked. They would fire when the trigger was pulled, but the impulse was not sufficiently strong. As a result, the fire control system still thought that the missile was attached to the airframe and therefore didn't tell it to fire. So even when the pin was pulled out by the umbilical coming away, the missile would still just not go. It's testament to the complexity of the Sparrow weapon system that 40 years after it was first developed, its problems were still being ironed out. Further upgrades were applied to AIM-7M in the 90s. The resultant AIM-7P featured software improvements that enhanced its ability to engage low-level targets. I believe that some versions are also capable of receiving mid-course guidance instructions from the launching aircraft. Even with upgrades, the only area where the Sparrow remains superior to the AMRAAM, though, was in the warhead size. The AIM-7 has an 88-pound warhead versus 44 on the AMRAAM. I imagine there are some limited tactical situations in which that might have been useful. AIM-7P remained in service until about 2018. A couple of other versions of Sparrow are worth mentioning before I close this one out. In the 1950s, a much larger weapon called Sparrow X was proposed, combining the guidance package of Sparrow III with the W-42 nuclear warhead of the Genie. It was a big unit, weighing 850 pounds and built on a nearly 15-inch diameter missile body. Range was 20 miles at altitude, but as with all early Sparrows, you're realistically looking at 6 to 8 on a good day. Sparrow X never got beyond the early design phase. There were also at least 2 experiments with infrared homing Sparrows. The first, generally referred to as the Sparrow Winder, simply combined the infrared homing seeker and control system of the Sidewinder with the Sparrow motor, fuse, and warhead. Testing was performed at China Lake, but the missile didn't reach production. More serious was the slightly mysterious AIM-7R. Apparently, this was developed for the US Navy in the 80s and combined a small IR seeker with the AIM-7P and its semi-active radar homing system. Once fired, the IR sensor was directed to pick up and lock onto the target by the radar guidance system at some stage during the flight. The idea was to allow the firing aircraft to stop illuminating the target with its radar and leave it free to engage another target. AIM-7R saw some production and presumably some were carried operationally. Rumours that a pre-production missile shot down an Iraqi fighter in Desert Storm appear to be false, however. All told, 69,000 Sparrows were produced by the US and its allies between the middle 50s and 2000. Over its career, Sparrows were used to down around 140 aircraft, second only to the Sidewinder. Despite its flaws, it was a remarkable, even a pioneering weapon system. It is also a real demonstration that for all their genius, most advanced weapon systems are highly complex and finicky beasts. A lot has to go right for them to function correctly, even at today's technology frontier. I hope you've enjoyed this one. It's been a whole year in the making. As ever, I look forward to your comments and insights.